For it. And we are live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the bigger picture with our live virtual studio audience. And boy, is it wonderful to see you all again. I can't believe it's been so long. But here we go. The bigger picture, a 2-week mini-series on the last 2 parshiot of the book of Bereshit. So it's a double whammy, and there's going to be some big stuff that we're going to be covering. So get yourselves ready, because my waffling is about to commence. So the truth is, I think you all have to assume that you won't get everything on the first run. You might have to revisit this and think over it, because some of what we're talking about is probably things. I mean, there might have been a lot of things that you've never necessarily heard before, but I think that this especially, there's some things that we're going to be learning together which are going to be really difficult to wrap your head around. There's a lot to think about. Now the good news is a lot of it is story time, but when we get into the meat and the crunchy material, it's going to be really quite interesting. Not that it wouldn't be anyway, but you know what I mean. So we'll give it a go, and we'll just approach this with an open mind and with patience. And as I said, if you need to watch this again afterwards, then so be it. But I think you'll find that it's quite enriching, quite interesting, and quite eye-opening. So we've only got Vayigash and Vayechi to go for the rest of the book of Bereshit. But the truth is, we're going to do a lot to link back in with Parshat Miketz that we've already kind of seen. Because as we know, the story of Joseph and his brothers spreads over quite a few parshiot. And we know a lot of the story, and we know the basics of the story, but our knowledge doesn't necessarily go far beyond that. And I know for a fact that there are people who have quite a lot of questions on especially the end part of the story once we get into the brothers descending down into Egypt. So let's just explore the basics for starters, because the basics are pretty nuts. All right, so if we take ourselves back to the beginning, right, when we start to hear about Joseph. So we know that Joseph is the favorite child, and we know that he gets gifted with a special coat, and that he has dreams about his brothers bowing down to him. And instead of inspiring his brothers with this, they get jealous and they hate him, and they decide that they want to kill him. And so there's that whole interaction early on in the narrative where just at the last minute almost, they decide that they're going to throw him into a pit. And that's not good enough, and they end up selling him down to Egypt. And at this point in the story, we're thinking to ourselves, there's no chance that they are ever going to be bowing down to him. The Parsha opened with dreams of kingship, and at this point, he is just in the lowest place. He's been sold into slavery in Egypt, and all his dad gets is a torn, bloodied coat. So Yosef goes down to Egypt. He works as a servant until that doesn't work because of the episode with Potiphar, and he ends up in jail. He ends up in prison, at which point he interprets the dreams of the butler and the baker. And the butler, who gets freed from prison, goes back to Pharaoh, and eventually, beginning of Parshat Miketz, he mentions to Pharaoh that there's a guy languishing in prison who should be able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. So Yosef gets presented to Pharaoh, and if we recall, Yosef actually turns around to Pharaoh and says he's not going to be able to interpret the dreams. Everything that he says, everything that he interprets, it actually comes from Hashem. But as a result of interpreting the dreams, he gets promoted to be the number 2 in Egypt. And at this point, he gets a new name, Savnat Paneach, which, if you remember, we explored the roots and the translation of that name in our previous series. He gets a new wife. He has 2 children. Everything is grand. Everything is amazing. And 7 years after the years of bounty, the famine hits. And lo and behold, his brothers come down and they have to buy their food from Yosef. That's a very long, windy story. And we should think then that he's had this moment of greatness at the beginning with his dreams. He's had all of these lows in prison and in the house of Potiphar and being sold into slavery. And now he's the second in command in Egypt. And his brothers are right there in front of him. And we would think then that all should be okay. But then Yosef goes and does something very odd and very strange. And instead of reuniting with his brothers, he starts messing with them. And he accuses them of being spies. And on the surface level, it seems so immature and juvenile that this should be his reaction. Prove to me you're not spies. Go bring Binyamin back down to Egypt. He keeps Shimon in jail until they get back. Yaakov refuses to send Binyamin, and it's only when they run out of food and they are starving that eventually Yaakov relents. And when they return to Egypt, this time with Binyamin, so Yosef messes with them again, and he does strange things. He puts them in age order, and when they leave, he's planted a goblet in Binyamin's sack, and the army chases after them because Binyamin has stolen the goblet. And we reach this climax at the end of Miketz, heading into Vayigash, where everyone is very, very tense. And Binyamin is on the verge now of being in big trouble for this crime that he has supposedly committed. And it's at the beginning of Vayigash, those opening words, when Yehuda steps up and he puts his life on the line to try and save Binyamin. And that is the straw that breaks the camel's back. And that is when Yosef breaks down and he can't take it anymore and he reveals his identity. And that's all come about through a very, very strange episode. And so after that, they've reunited, they reconcile, Yaakov comes down, everyone lives happily ever after, and the book of Bereshit comes to an end with the death of Yaakov in Parshat Vayechi. And so on surface level, it's a crazy story. Surely it's worthy of a West End musical. Such is the type of story that it is. And one comes away from the story struggling to understand how Hashem fits into this picture, how he can allow this all to happen, how he runs the world or allows the world to be run. And so that's really what we're going to try and unpack together a little bit tonight. And we're going to start with some new concepts. You guys ready for some new concepts? Excellent. So here we go. This is not necessarily familiar territory for me, certainly presented in this way, but let's try and handle this together. So when trying to understand the difficult concept of Hanhagat Hashem, of the conduct of Hashem in this world, one of the most important places to look is in the works of Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who lived a few hundred years ago, and he is incredible author, and he many books. But two of his most famous books, actually, he's got 3 famous books, but the 2 that we're going to mention this evening one is called Derech Hashem, which is a systemized look at how Hashem has created the world and how things run and why different systems are in place. Really, really fantastic Sefer book to go through. And I recommend the version that I've put for you on the screen there. It's got a lot of rich commentaries to help with the understanding of this book. But the second book that he writes is called Da'at Tevunot, which is rather poorly translated as Knowing God's Plan. But this as well, I didn't even know this one existed. I'm quite excited to go and find this one for myself. But also a beautifully translated and explained book, which takes things up a notch. And in Dat Tuvunot, he very much talks about the way that God runs the world. So how does God run the world according to the Ramchal? And this is pretty authoritative stuff in the way that he breaks this down for us. Very, very beautiful. So there's two types of hanhaga, two types of conduct that Hashem uses to run the world. The first is hanhagat hamishpat, which you'd really translate as God running the world based on judgment, based on the attribute of din. And this is probably how most of us relate to how God runs the world. It's basically the concept of reward and punishment based on our actions. You do a positive mitzvah, you avoid the negative mitzvah. If I do the right thing, I'm going to get rewarded. If I do the wrong thing, I'm going to get punished. I'm going to have some kind of consequence come my way. If I do the right thing, I bring the world closer to perfection. If I do the wrong thing, I take the world further away from perfection. So that's a very, very surface level understanding of Hanhagat HaMishpat, the individual oversight, the way in which Hashem sees all that we do and responds and reacts accordingly. The second type of Hanhaga, however, is Hanhagat HaYichud. Yichud coming from the word Echad, oneness. And this is the way that God guides the world in a way that brings about the unity of all things. Hashem, as we know, is the source of all things, and the ultimate destination of reality is to return everything back to that source. And what that means is that every single moment, the world is moving towards the ultimate tikkun, the ultimate fixing, the ultimate perfect state. And every single second of every single minute of every single hour of every single day, the world is moving in a direction dictated by Hashem. And that's whether people do mitzvot or not. It's regardless of our free will actions. There is a certain conduct. There's a certain way that Hashem is moving the world throughout history to a point of ultimately reaching a point of perfection. That's two very different and two very distinct ways. One is very much individualized, tailor-made, as it were, to the responses and to the reactions of individual actions. And the other is what I've called there, quite conveniently and quite tastefully, I think, the bigger picture, right? Hashem moving the world, moving history and humanity through history, reaching a point of perfection and a point of unity with him. And those are, as presented by the Ramchal, the two ways in which Hashem is overseeing how the world develops. Now, we can think of this in a slightly nope, we don't want to go there yet. We can think of this in a slightly more developed way, because let's go back to this slide. The Hanhagat HaMishpat is very much the detail, very much the individual, and within that structure, within that system, the presumption is that every single detail, every single individual in the system is going to have the freedom to do what they want and is going to be judged individually based on their own actions. And yet the klal, the general wider organism that is humanity, is going to be moving towards a destination, even though as individuals, as details, they're going to be free to do whatever they want. The example that was presented in the material that I draw from is a car insurance company. In order to be able to provide a quote for car insurance, there has to be some kind of understanding, some kind of estimate made about how many car accidents there are going to be across the country. And that's based on a klal prediction. a general expectation for the klal, despite the fact that every individual is going to have the freedom of choice to basically get into an accident or not get into an accident. So on a klal basis, on a general perspective, you can make an educated guess about how things are going to move throughout the course of any given year and how many individuals will end up getting into car accidents, but you're not defining who those individuals are, right? That's going to be down to each individual person, whether they end up getting into an accident or not, based on how well or badly they drive. Each individual will have the freedom of choice to go in that direction or to not go in that direction. But you are still able to see how something more general, how something broader, how something bigger than the individual details are going to be, which direction they're going to be moving in. So every single person has the freedom of choice. And if they do the right thing, then they're going to have a reward. And Hashem can still utilize the results of those actions to move the world towards tikkun. As I said, if we haven't got that on the first go, then we might have to go over it again. But the principle is as follows: that there are two ways, as we said, two levels, I guess, of intervention in the way that Hashem oversees and governs the world. An individual relationship, an individual level of conduct, of oversight, of guidance, in which people who do the right thing are going to be rewarded, people who do the wrong thing are going to be facing consequences, are going to be punished. But more general than that is Hagat HaYichud, which is where the world is moving in a direction, regardless of what each individual does. And the system will balance itself, and Hashem will find the way of balancing the system based on what individuals end up doing. So let's return to Yosef. So Yosef has a dream. Yosef has a dream that people are going to bow down to him. But the exile that he has to endure is the complete opposite of that end goal. And he goes down to Mitzrayim and he ends up in prison. But then not only does he end up as a ruler in Egypt, but he ends up being the ruler in the land, which is going to be the storehouse for everyone to come down and get food during the famine, because he is in charge of distributing the food. And what's incredible is that when he finally sees his brothers don't even recognize him, right? Chapter 45, verse 3, in Parshat Vayigash, Vayome Yosef elechav, ani Yosef aod avichai, v'lo. So he finally breaks his silence and he turns to his brothers. He says, "I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? V'lo yachlu achiv la'anot." Am I in the right place? Yes, I am in the right place. Thank you. Right? But his brothers couldn't even answer him. They were so dumbfounded. They were completely speechless that the person that they've been looking at all of this time while they've been coming down to Egypt is none other than their brother Yosef. Now, they have carried the burden of what they did to him for decades, right? We often think of this story so simplistically that, you know, how could they not have recognized him? Oh, he had a beard. Oh, what? So he had a beard. I couldn't figure out that it was Yosef. Whatever the case, at this point, when Yosef finally breaks his silence, they haven't recognized him. They're completely speechless from the fact that they are now staring face to face with their brother. And all of a sudden, this crashing moment of realization, everything that they did all of those years ago, the way that they've held that for the last however many decades, it's a huge moment. They're finally reunited. They should reconcile. And that seems to be what happens if we continue through the rest of the parasha. Yosef sets them up in Goshen, right? And they settle over there. And then Yaakov comes down to Mitzrayim. They're reunited. But 17 years after they arrive in Egypt, Yaakov dies. And if we look at what happens at that point in the story, something very strange happens. Immediately after his death in Parshat Vayechi, the brothers freak out. And they automatically assume that Yosef is going to kill them. And so the brothers have to send messages to Yosef saying, Dad has said that you shouldn't kill us. And just imagine, put yourself in Yosef's place for a moment. Yosef has thought for 17 years that he's been reconciled with his brothers, that they're all fine. And yet he then finds out that they haven't reconciled at all. And let's have a look at the verses a little bit. So chapter 50, that's right at the end. Chapter 50, right, verse 15. Hope everyone can see it on the screen there. Joseph's brothers perceived that their father was dead, and they said, perhaps Joseph will nurse hatred against us, and then he will surely repay us all the evil that we did to him. So they instructed that Joseph be told, your father gave orders before his death, saying, thus shall you say to Joseph, oh, please kindly forgive the spiteful deed of your brothers and their sin, for they have done you evil. So now please forgive the spiteful deed of the servants of your father's God. And Joseph's reaction, verse 17, he breaks down in tears when he hears this. Verse 18, his brothers themselves also went and flung themselves before him and said, we are ready to be your slaves. But Joseph said to them, fear not, do not fear. Right? Verse 19, Vayomer aleim Yosef, al tiro, don't be afraid. Ki hatachat Elohim ani? Am I instead of God? Verse 20, although you intended me harm, God intended it for good in order to accomplish. It is as clear as this day that a vast people be kept alive. So now fear not, I will sustain you and your young ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke to their heart. Finally, they get consoled. Joseph says, am I in place of God? You might have thought that I thought badly about you, but I'm looking after you. And then finally, they were consoled. And what we see with Yosef at this point is that he understood the difference between Hanhagat HaYichud and Hanhagat HaMishpat. When he was sold and he was individually going through that dark, dark time, it was bad. That was Mishpat. That was the judgment. That was the individual response that Yosef was faced with. But it doesn't change the fact that the world is marching towards Tikkun. And through that very act itself, through that lowest of lows, it launched off the chain of events that would lead to the eventual goal of history. So their bad action didn't change the eventual goal. So when it comes to Hanhagat HaMishpat, it's always between you or me or anyone and God as to what we have done. And sure, it would have been nicer to not have to go through bad times, but we haven't actually changed, as it were, anything. Yosef was still able to see the bigger picture, the grander perspective. Does anyone have any comments or questions so far? Apart from Lawrence, no joking. Go on.
What do you mean apart from me? Is it because I'm Jewish? Look, I understand what you're saying here, but there's several bits that don't quite gel with me. One is that when the brothers returned to Canaan, to Yaakov, he has to speak to God before he goes into Egypt. Because and God says to Yaakov, I will make thee a great nation. And that's the only reason that he really went down to Mitzrayim to meet Yosef at the end of the day. And secondly, as you quite rightly say, it was 17 years that Yaakov was down in Egypt. Why didn't the family go back? Why didn't they go back at that time? Because if they went back to bury him, the family could have stayed there.
Well, from a Hanhagat HaYichud perspective, if people are understanding the bigger picture and the move towards where things are heading, I would assume that's why they stick around. they're being looked after by Yosef. They've been set up with prime real estate, and they've been told that there's been a prophecy that they're going to be down in Egypt. So I guess they're waiting for that cue to be able to return. I guess that cue isn't being given, so they stay. Maybe.
It's way to have asked.
No, it's a good question, but I think that's a good answer. Okay, so that's the difference between Hanhagat HaYichud and Hanhagat HaMishpat and Hanhagat HaYichud. That even though dark times came Yosef's way, and even though what he went through was bad, it didn't impact his ability to reconcile with the brothers, because he understood that it was all part of a bigger picture. He understood that that everything was moving towards an eventual goal. Now, let's take us into another area. At the beginning of Vayigash, I don't know who managed to find the time to have a flick through these two parashiyot, but at the beginning of Vayigash, Yehuda throws himself in front of the viceroy, doesn't know who he is yet, and he pleads with Yosef to take him instead of Binyamin, because his father will never get over it. And if we are paying attention to the story, we will notice that Yehuda is also the one who decided to sell Yosef to Egypt in the first place. So what happened to Yehuda between part one of the story, where he is the one who sells Yosef to Egypt, and part two of the story, where he is willing to put his life on the line in order to save Binyamin? Who can remember what happened to Yehuda? Anyone?
Wasn't it the episode with his daughter-in-law?
The episode with his daughter-in-law and with his sons, right? If we remember, we were just getting into the nitty-gritty of a really good story back in Parashat Vayeshev, and then all of a sudden, the narrative stops, and we have this whole chunk of episode, of narrative, which talks about Yehuda and Tamar. He lost two of his sons. He experienced the pain of losing two children. And this adds a whole new layer to understanding this story. He had two children, Er and Onan, who died. And as a result of that, he had this third child who was too young, apparently, to marry Tamar. And so everything gets put on hold. And then Tamar ends up having a relationship with him, and she's almost put to death. And then he ends up having to admit his wrongdoing. So that whole episode should help us unlock a new way of understanding what's going on with Yehuda at this point. Now, we could ask ourselves a question. Are we trying to say that Er and Onan died to teach Yehuda a lesson, that he had to go through the experience of losing two children so that he would understand what it means to have Yaakov losing Yosef and then potentially his second child as well? Are we trying to say that all came about because Yehuda needed to learn a lesson? So the answer to that is no. They died because they were punished for their actions. That's what we read about in the story. They had done something for which Hashem deemed them deserving of death. However, their death also served the purpose of developing Yehuda's perspective on his actions. And so their deaths work on a mishpat level, on an individual level, as a response to the actions that they had done. But it also works on a yichud level as well. It also helps with Yehuda being able to understand something grander and bigger than just his individual story. And the truth is that history always works on both of these levels if we develop the the sensitivity and we develop the antennae to be able to see history in that way. There's another powerful example of this from the book of Shmuel Base, part 2 of the book of Samuel. And at this point, King David is running away from his son Avshalom. And I've got for you there, chapter 16 on the screen. At this point in the story, King David is running away from his son Avshalom. And while he is fleeing, he stops in a place called Bachurim. And Shimi ben Gera comes out to greet him and bring him in. And now Shimi ben Gera is a holy Jew. But yet, as we see, he starts yelling and cursing out King David. So let's have a look at a little bit of what we're talking about. Verse 5, King David came until Bachurim, and behold, a man of Saul's family. Now, King Saul was dead against King David, and his family were dead against King David. So a man of Saul's family was coming out from there, named Shimi ben Gera, and he was cursing King David as he was coming out. He pelted David and all of King David's servants with stones, as well as all the people and the soldiers to his right and to his left. And
Rabbi Nick, it's not clear on the screen.
Oh dear, I'm not sure what I can do about that.
If you're expecting us to read it, I certainly can't.
Anyone else experiencing that? Yeah, how unfortunate. See, on my screen it's just fine.
It's all fuzzy.
Maybe. How am I going to solve that problem?
I don't think you can. You just have to read it slowly so that we take what you're saying.
I think I might have to. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah. Wonder why that is. See, it looks clear there. I don't know. It must be something to do with Zoom. But everything else has been coming out clear?
No, not particularly.
Oh, really? Okay. In that case, I will just have to read very, very, very slowly. Let's see how it's coming up on Zoom. No, also unclear. That's a pity. Oh, I'll have to look into that for next week. I'm sorry about that, folks. I don't know why it's not coming out clear. There must be some kind of setting that I need to tweak. I'll try and do that for next week. My apologies. In future, Kathy, please do tell me about that very in advance, and I'll see what I can do. Okay, so...
Hang on, can you give me the chapter and verse again, please?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, yes. If you're sitting in front of your Tanakh, then please do tune in to your own books. Samuel 2, Shmuel Bet, chapter 16. And I was starting on verse 5. If you've got an art scroll, take a Tanakh, it's on page 762 and 763.
Verse 2. Okay.
Okay, so King David comes to Bachurim, and Shimi ben Gera, who is from Saul's family, comes out, and he's cursing King David. He's pelting King David with stones, as well as everyone that is with. And Shimi is saying to him, go out, you man of bloodshed, you base man. Hashem is repaying you for all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead you have reigned, and has given over the kingdom into the hand of Avshalom your son. Behold, you are now afflicted, because you are a man of bloodshed. And the verse continues, verse 9. Avishai, son of Zeruiah, who is King David's right-hand man, says to King David, why should this dead dog curse my lord, the king? I will go on ahead and take off his head. Avishai says, why are you letting him curse you? Let me go and kill him. Says King David in verse 10, Vayomer HaMelech, King David says, Ma li v'lachem b'nei Zeruiah. What does it matter to me or to you, O sons of Zeruiah? Ki kalel, ki Hashem, amar lo kalel, et David. He is cursing because Hashem has said to him, curse David. Umi yomar, madua asita ken. So who can then say, why have you done this? King David turns to Avishai, his right-hand man. He says, this guy is only able to curse me because Hashem has allowed him to curse me. The only way that this guy would have been able to curse King David is if Hashem allows him to. Hashem could have prevented this scenario in a million different ways. It could have been bad weather. There could have been a tree falling in the road. There could have been any obstacle in any permutation, in any kind of way that would have meant that King David and Shimei ben Gera never came across each other, never crossed each other's paths, never interacted with each other. And so if it happened because Hashem willed it. That is what King David is trying to teach his people at that moment. And so if we peel back the layers even more, what's fascinating is that this is an interaction between the descendants of Yosef and the descendants of Yehuda, because King David is from the tribe of Yehuda and Saul is from the descendants of Yosef. But what's going on here is that King David is expressing this concept of Hanhagat HaYichud. He is expressing the fact that, yes, there's something that's happening to him personally. That's Hanhagat HaMishpat. That's bad. That is painful. That hurts. But from Hanhagat HaYichud, from the perspective of Hashem moving the world through a particular plan, it's the bigger picture. Now, what's fascinating is that King David becomes king. He passes on the throne to his son, King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech. And right before he dies, he has a list of things for King Solomon to do. If we open up the book of Kings, Kings 1, chapter 2, right, page 801, if you've got an art scroll Tanakh in front of you, right, chapter 2 of Melachim Aleph. So this is King David at the end of his lifetime. I apologize again that you can't see this on the screen. It's really frustrating. But I'll read it to you. King David's days drew near to die, and he instructed his son Shlomo, saying, I am going the way of all the earth. Be strong and become a man. Safeguard the charge of Hashem, your God, to walk in his ways, to observe his decrees, commandments, ordinances, and testimonies, as written in the Torah of Moses, so that you will succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn, so that Hashem will uphold his word that he spoke to me, saying, if your children will safeguard their way to walk before me sincerely with all their heart and with all their soul, saying, no man of yours will ever be cut off from upon the throne of Israel. It's building up to something else though. Verse 5. Furthermore, you know what Yoav, son of Zeruiah, did to me, and what he did to two commanders of the armies of Israel, to Avner son of Ner, and to Amasa son of Yeter, who he killed, shedding blood of war in peacetime, and placing the blood of war in the girdle that is on his loins, and on his shoes that are on his feet. Verse 6, you shall act according to your wisdom, and do not allow his white hair to go down to the grave in peace. But here we go. Let's skip ahead to verse 8. Behold, with you is Shimei, son of Gera. This is the guy that came out to curse. He cursed me with a powerful curse on the day that I went to Machanaim. But he came down to meet me at the Jordan, and I swore to him by Hashem, saying, I will not put you to death by the sword. So when he interacts with Shimei ben Gera, he gave him this horrible curse, but he swore that he wouldn't kill him. But verse 9, he turns to King Shlomo, at the end of his life, and he says, but now you shall not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man, and you will know what you are to do to him, and you shall bring his white hair to the grave in blood. And then King David dies. Vayishkav David im avotav, vayikaver be'ir David. That he lay with his forefathers and was buried in the city of David. So he sees the bigger picture. At the time, he doesn't do anything about it. But fast forward down those years, it then falls to King Shlomo to take some kind of responsibility for what Shimi ben Gera did, even though King David at the time decided not to do it. So let's come back to Yosef. Yosef is the one who can see the bigger picture. He is the one who, if you remember what we have said in previous classes, he is the one who can dream because he sees the past and the future at the same time. And it's interesting because when Yosef is in front of his brothers, he basically has two options. He can either reveal his identity straight away or not reveal his identity straight away. But he opts for a third option, which is to torture his brothers. And we have to ask ourselves why. And I think hopefully the answer is starting to become a little clearer to us. The answer is because Yosef understands and he knows the bigger picture. And he knows that his brothers have to do teshuvah so that they can unite together. And so he allows himself to become the agent of Hashem to bring the brothers to teshuvah. It's not just some juvenile, immature revenge ploy that Yosef takes advantage of to be able to torment his brothers. There's something bigger and there's something grander that's going on with the interaction that they have before they eventually figure out who he is. If we take a look at chapter 2 in Parashat Miketz, I'll give you a moment to find it, page 107 if you've got an art scroll. All right, this part of the story is just as the famine has got too intense for Yaakov and his family. And so Yaakov is sending the brothers down to Mitzrayim. He doesn't send Binyamin with them. And we get to verse 5. So the sons of Israel came to buy provisions among the arrivals, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Verse 6, now Yosef was the viceroy over the land. He was the provider to all the people of the land. Yosef's brothers came and they bowed to him, faces to the ground, finally reaching that point, fulfilling the destiny. Yosef saw his brothers and he recognized them, but he acted like a stranger and he spoke with them harshly. And from here, that is where Yosef starts to put them through a proper difficult time. And he accuses them of being spies. And they say, no, we're not spies. And he says, no, you are spies. So if we fast forward to verse 18 or verse 17, that he keeps them at bay for a 3-day period. And then on the third day, he says, if I fear God, if you are truthful people, brothers, be imprisoned in your place of confinement while you go and bring provisions for the hunger of your households. Verse 20, then bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified and you will not die. And they did so. And verse 21, this is what I want us to focus on. Verse 21, Vayomru ish el achiv, they said to one another, Aval ashemim anachnu al achinu. Indeed, we are guilty concerning our brother. Asher ra'inu tsarat nafsho b'itchanano eleinu v'lo shamanu. Because we saw his heartfelt anguish when he pleaded with us, and we didn't listen. Al-Kain, therefore, ba eleinu hatsara hazot. That is why this anguish is falling upon us. The brothers turn to each other and say, all of this is their fault, because they didn't listen to their brother when he cried out. Reuven turns to his brothers. He says, Vayan Reuven otam. Reuven says to them, Lemor, saying, Halo amarti aleichem lemor, al techetu vayeled. Did I not say to you, don't sin against this boy? V'lo shmata. You didn't listen. V'gam damor hine nidrash. And his blood as well. Now look what's happening to us. We're being avenged for what we did to our brother. Now Yosef's hearing this as well. So we have to understand, we have to ask ourselves, why doesn't he reveal himself at this point? Verse 23, they didn't know that Yosef understood, for an interpreter was between them. And he turned away from them and wept. So he's already crying at this point. He's already understanding that they are full of remorse. They're full of regret. So why doesn't he reveal himself at that point? Why does it get so much more intense? And the answer is because that's only one level of their teshuvah. He had to push them into the exact same situation, the situation where a son of Rachel is about to be lost to Yaakov. Are you going to let it happen? Are you going to be willing to put yourself into slavery to stop it from happening again? That is where Yosef is getting the brothers back to. And when Yosef realizes that he has orchestrated the complete teshuvah process within Yehuda, when Yehuda launches himself forward and stands there eyeball to eyeball with Yosef and says, you will not do this. If this is what you're going to do, if you are going to take Benjamin away from our father, I am going to tear this place down. And once that reaches that point, that is when Yosef clears the room and reveals his identity. In a broader perspective, that's the process that we have been discussing. Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, and Mashiach ben Yosef needs to pave the way for Mashiach ben David. It's all about the ultimate goal, where Yehuda does teshuvah, and the Malchus, the kingdom, can return to Yehuda until the end of days. It's all Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim. It's all a microcosm of where history is flowing towards. It's the Hanhagat HaYichud, the bigger picture that is at stake here, not the Hanhagat HaMishpat, not just nitpicking, not just being spiteful and immature and juvenile and trying to get one up on his brothers. Yosef is moving the situation towards an important goal. What's amazing is, by the way, the Haftarah for Vayigash is a vision of Yechezkel, where he takes two trees, one with Yosef written on it and one with Yehuda written on it, and the trees are brought together, and that's symbolic of everything that's happening here, all of the layers that are occurring between Yosef and Yehuda, the descendants of Yosef and the descendants of Yehuda. So, to bring our session to a close, to try and summarize this a little bit, we can conclude by saying the way Hashem runs the world is very complex. If we've learned nothing else tonight, we've learned that the way Hashem runs the world is very complex. But while it's difficult to understand why things happen when they happen and why things happen the way they happen, the world is always moving along a process towards an eventual tikkun and towards teshuvah. And that moment, that climactic moment when Yosef just can't take it anymore, and he screams out, Ani Yosef, I am Yosef. And at that moment, the cloud that had been forming over the brothers' eyes and their brains, all of a sudden, just everything makes sense. Ani Yosef, they realize, it all makes sense. That moment of Ani Yosef, that moment of clarity, parallels the Ani Hashem that we will hear at the end of days, when we have complete clarity of how and why everything was put into motion the way it was. That moment at the end of days when we will just have this clarity, this understanding of how everything has been moving in a particular way throughout all of human history. Eventually it will make sense to us, and at that time when it does make sense, we will have that same elation, that same lifting of the cloud over our own eyes, where we can now understand Ani Hashem. There has been a purpose to this. There has been a Hanhagat HaYichud that has been moving us to a point of unity, to a point of oneness, to a point of connection to Hashem. And please God, that should come very soon in our days. Amen. Okay, folks. There you go. Next week, we are going to be talking about the end of days. So that's all in store for us next week, looking at Parashat Vayechi. If you didn't get the chance to read through Vayigash and Vayechi, I do encourage you to be able to do so. And if you need me to send anything across to you, I can help you with that. Normally I send out a link, don't I, to being able to read it on Safari, and I haven't done. I apologize for that. But it's good to try and be a little bit tuned in to what's coming up. So that will be next week on Parashat Vayechi, the end of days. But that's all for tonight. So do we have any comments on questions? Or questions, I should think. If we do, say goodbye to all the people on Facebook. Come join us on Zoom if you want to be able to ask your questions. But for now,